All right, I guess we're ready to begin. So good afternoon and welcome everyone to a public meeting of the Public Interest Declassification Board. My name is Bill Fisher. I'm the Executive Secretary of the PIDB. The PIDB has been advocating for deploying artificial intelligence and machine learning tools to automate classification and declassification. We are aware that past methods and practices are inadequate for the volume of records requiring declassification review, and this will be more challenging as we deal with the exponential growth of classified digital records. The PIDB has been discussing with experts from federal agencies and interest groups the impact and potential benefits of these technologies. Today we will be hearing from the Departments of State and Defense about projects using artificial intelligence and machine learning to modernize the declassification of records. And I'd just like to say that this work really supports the work of the National Archives. As Dr. Colleen Shogan, the Archivist of the United States, likes to say, we are in the business of preserving, protecting, and sharing. And the work that the PIDB is doing definitely, totally supports this idea of sharing, especially downstream with declassification. So I'm very excited about the work that the PIDB is doing in this area. And now with that, I'll turn the meeting over to Mary DeRosa, the chair of the PIDB.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mary DeRosa. Thanks to everybody for being here, both in person, and I know we have some people remotely as well. I'm going to say a few words about the PIDB and about the program today. Not a lot, because I want to get to our speakers as quickly as possible. PIDB was established in the 2000 by legislation. The mandate by statute is, this is a kind of paraphrase, but to promote the fullest possible public access to thorough, accurate, and reliable documentary record of national security decisions and activities. So we advise the president and others in the executive branch about classification and declassification policies. Over the years, the board has advocated for modernization. Over its entire history, has advocated for modernization of our declassification and classification processes. As William Fisher just said, we have had, over the past several years, a consistent focus on this urgent challenge of the upcoming, the digital records, massive increase both in born digital records and analog records that have been digitized. And the volume, as you will hear from our speakers, is enormous, and our traditional techniques are simply not equipped to handle what's coming, which is, of course, a threat to transparency and the goals that the archives and the PID care very much about. Our speakers today are developing innovative techniques using our artificial intelligence that the government can use to address these problems. The work they're doing is very important, and I hope you enjoy the presentations. So the way we'll proceed is to first hear from the presentations from the speakers. Then there will be a discussion between the speakers and the board. We'll ask some questions and have a discussion, and then we'll have questions from the audience. But first, I'd like to quickly introduce the other members of the board. I will say quickly, everybody has very impressive bios, and I am not going to read them all, but I encourage you to go on our website and see them all. So I'll start with the Vice Chair of the Board, Alyssa Starzak. She has also served as acting chair. She has been appointed twice to the board by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. She is currently Vice President and Global Head of Public Policy at Cloudflare. And if anybody doesn't know what that is, it's a web security and optimization company. Carter, going alphabetically, Carter Burwell, right here, was appointed to the board by Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. He is currently counsel in the white collar and regulatory defense practice at the Debevoise and Plimpton law firm. Lots of positions I'm leaving out of all of these bios. Andrew Burns, maybe you can raise your hand when I mention you. Andrew Burns was appointed to the board by President Biden. He's the founder and principal of Burns Impact, a consulting firm that advises innovative companies on a variety of matters, including public policy and corporate communications. He also is founder of the company Adventures in Syncopation. Ezra Cohen is past chair of the board and is serving his second term on the PIDB. First, he was appointed by President Trump and more recently by Speaker Mike Johnson. He served in a variety of positions in the defense and intelligence communities, including as acting Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security. Laura DeMonos, we don't have her with us today. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here, but she has been twice appointed by President Biden to the board and once by President Obama. So she's a real veteran of the board, and she's served in a variety of positions in the information, technology, and media fields. David Hickton, over at the end, was appointed to the board by President Biden. David founded the University of Pittsburgh Institute for Cyber Law and Policy and Security, Cyber Law Policy and Security, and he's a member of the faculty of the University Schools of Law, Computing and Information, and the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. Finally, last but not least, Carmen Medina. Raise your hand, Carmen. Well, you're the only one who hasn't raised your hand yet. So she was also appointed to the board by President Biden. Carmen is a retired senior federal executive with 32 years of experience in the intelligence community. She is a recognized expert on intelligence analysis, strategic thinking, and innovation, among many other things. Finally, before moving to our speakers, I want to just quickly introduce in the audience, I don't know if Tommy is here. There you are. Our colleagues from the Information Security and Oversight Office, who we could not do our work without. First there's Tomi Ajiboye, and Bill Carpenter. This, of course, is in addition to William Fisher, who we already heard from. And then I really want to recognize Sharmila Bhatia, who has been indispensable and put this meeting together for us. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Carmen Medina to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you all for coming. This is unscripted what I'm going to do here, so buckle up. But I noticed just as we started that a couple that were sitting up there left, and they looked a lot like tourists. And I thought that was such an interesting way to spend your time in DC, is to, look up on Eventbrite open access meetings and to see how your government works. So I'm just curious if we have any other touring Americans in attendance here. No. Okay, well, they left, so what can we say? I'm here to introduce Tim Coots. Tim is going to talk to us about the State Department's efforts to use technology to solve their records management issues. Tim has been working in records management issues for a decade at the State Department, and he's been trying to wrestle this problem to the ground. He started off his professional life as a Marine, and so, of course, he is still a Marine. And I don't know which you would say is harder, being a Marine, infantry, or solving or trying to solve records problems in the federal government. As a Marine, he served at Camp David in the Presidential Security Detail, and I tried to get some juicy stories out of him about either President Bush or President Obama, but he did not provide me anything interesting. But there is some information about the dogs I can share privately afterwards. That was a joke. So without any further ado, Tim, please.
Thank you very much for having me here today. I want to thank the board, National Archives, and you all for my presentation today. It's going to focus on results using AI. There's no doubt that AI has the potential to enhance public disclosure and transparency. And there's lots of hype around AI in particular, right? AI can solve all our problems. Well, I will show you two case studies, two pilots, and one actually I consider now in production, no longer a pilot, related to declassification and FOIA, in which AI is providing results to State Department in its programs. Next slide, please. Oh, I hit the clicker. Okay. All right, so a little bit about us first, right? My office and what we do. I think it's important to kind of frame where we are at the intersection of a few different key program areas that really influence transparency in government. So my office is the principal advisor on everything records management, Freedom of Information Act, classification, declassification, congressional document production, really everything information access and information management. We serve every employee across 200 plus missions abroad. We work with the interagency, as well as our partners in DoD, which you'll hear from shortly. But most importantly, we serve research communities and the public. So let's talk a little bit about our first piece, which is AI for declassification. Now, I'm a business person. My undergrad's in finance, so I have to kind of shape the challenge for you first as to what we're facing and why we are looking at AI, but we're also leaning in to AI in particular for declassification. You've heard that, there's a tsunami, there's a meteor, whatever you want to call it. There's a challenge upon us, right? And a lot of it's in part maybe to good record keeping, right? We're capturing more information than we ever have before with good digital record keeping. But you'll see in the declassification space, this results in a massive increase in the amount of material that must be reviewed. So we're at a point in time where AI could help productivity in this space. So as you all are aware, right, there's a 25-year automatic declassification cycle that agencies encumber. And with State Department, we have something called cables. And those cables are the authoritative reporting of U.S. diplomatic and consular posts overseas. And they are some of the most historically valuable records produced by state and I would say the U.S. government. Now, the volume of cables requiring review is increasing, right? We can't throw enough human resources at this problem. If you look at the chart on the top of the slide deck, right, there's an arrow that says we are here. It's like a little guide, right? We're in the 1999 review period because we review from 25 years prior. We're at a little over 100,000 cables. As you see, though, over the course of the next 5 years, that growth changes exponentially, right? So our current resourcing, the current manual approach to reviewing cables is not sufficient. Also, right, there's other types of records. We don't just produce cables at State Department. The capstone approach that the State Department adopted resulted in the exponential increase of classified emails that we're capturing. So the bottom chart here shows you where we are with emails in particular. Not that many were produced in 1999, but over time you could see the effects of the capstone approach, especially in the 2017 time period, where that volume increases dramatically. And of course, the pandemic kind of dropped that off a little bit, but right, we are steadying back out. So it takes a lot of effort, right, to manually review documents for declassification. And this is where AI in particular has a lot of potential. One thing though I wanted to kind of stress here is that my office is at the intersection of many different information access and disclosure programs. So we realize is that even if we were to undergo declassification, it doesn't necessarily mean under traditional processes that it's eligible at that instant it's declassified for public disclosure. So what we did is we married the FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, and its proactive disclosure approach with our cable declassification review. And I'll cover kind of what we're doing in that space in a minute. But it takes time, right? Just when an agency declassifies something doesn't necessarily mean the next day it's out there in the public domain. We have shortened that gap tremendously. So let's talk about what we did, right, and where we are today. Well, first, right, because AI was so new to our agency, we wanted to start small, right? If you look out there in the vendor space, you'll see that, you know, there's a lot of different things AI can do, and there's a lot of different promises being made. But what we said is, hey, we have one small problem, right? We want to replicate the human declassification review of just our cables, and we want to test if AI can do that and make it repeatable. So we started with a 3-month pilot. So we didn't want to be too big to fail, wanted to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars, and we chose cables from 1995. And we already had human review decisions on that, so we had training data. We were able to have the context and the content of what was rendered declassified under a human review. We trained the model on those decisions. And through the course of time, what we started realizing is this model's actually working pretty well. It needed to be fine-tuned. It wasn't as accurate, and it was a little still too risky for us in terms of its accuracy and precision. But we noticed, hey, we're onto something. So we said, you know what? We're going to continue our efforts in this space because of the potential this has. So we trained using past human review decisions, and we still kept human review, though. Something I want to kind of stress here is throughout this time, there were human checkpoints along the way. I think the fear with artificial intelligence in particular is that you're going to take the human completely out of the loop. Or, you know, my job as a declassification reviewer is going away. That is not the case in our pilot. Humans are always in the loop. They'll always review the training data. We have quality control checks along the way. When the model's unsure, right, the model says, I don't know, I'm not passing either a declassify or exempt decision, we put a human behind it because humans have intuition, right? And then things that also happen over time that we're seeing, and on the next slide I'll cover it, is there's something called model drift and sustainability. You got to keep these models trained, right? You can't just train one model and say, hey, this is going to work in perpetuity. There is a tail to artificial intelligence. But in short, in 1 year time, right, going back to this timeline, we had this idea, let's do a 3-month pilot. We started in October 2022. I believe my Deputy Assistant Secretary, Eric Stein, briefed about this last year around the same time period and said, hey, here's what state's doing. Well, in September of 2023, we had our first public release of AI declassified cables on our Freedom of Information Act reading room. So we had AI review cables, we had it render decisions, and we proactively released it out to the public. And just a little hint, at current state, we have a lot more cables that are reviewed. So let's talk about results just real quickly here in the AI space. One is we expanded public access. I mentioned that just because in traditional manual processes, just because we've reviewed something for declassification, it still would have to be transferred to the National Archives. It'd have to be accessioned. It would take time to get the public the ability to access that content. We're still transferring those cables to the National Archives. That's not ending that process, but what we're saying is hey, if this is declassified and there's no other reasons why we should withhold this information, Let's put it out there for the public to consume, knowing it's so historically valuable. So we've unified our declassification and FOIA processes. And right now, today, our total volume on our website is much less than what has actually been declassified for AI. So we've declassified 450,000 cables using AI. On our website, we've only released about 1,250 cables, close to about 8,000 pages. And you may say, well, why is that? Well, what we're finding is once again, just because it's declassified, there may be other sensitivities in that, right? There might be privacy information, certain things that require executive privilege. So that is also another area of opportunity for AI to speed up that process. So we've kind of overcome the declassification hurdle for cables. And now we're looking at, okay, our blocker is those other aspects of public disclosure. It's an adaptable process. So number two, right, is you can repeat this. You can use it for other means. You may need to retrain these models a little bit, and we've looked at them for other content, not just cables. Something we call our STARS system, so it's our old correspondence management system, used for action memos, info memos, briefing papers that go up to our senior officials, and we've deployed these models against it. They do require some retraining, and we're in the process of training that same model that we used on cables to apply it for other content. One thing on the cost perspective, we've reduced the human involvement by 80%. So we usually have a team of 12 personnel reviewing these cables on a yearly basis, full time, right? We freed up their time, and that could be better applied to the more difficult tasks. So AI, what we're seeing is AI is a good means of productivity enhancement. So we can have them focus on special projects, things of public interest that require a kind of more human-centric review, not just a repeatable process like cables. We've also had more consistent declassification decisions. Unlike me, the machine doesn't get tired, doesn't have a long commute into DC, doesn't skip over that sentence unintentionally or intentionally, right? It is repeatable. And when it makes mistakes, you can learn from those mistakes and you can retrain it and run it again. The processing time it takes once the model's trained, which takes about 3 months for every year of cables, between that human in the loop feedback, it takes the machine less than 10 minutes. All right, 10 minutes to run through a whole year's worth of cables and render a decision. And it's only 3 decisions it can render: declassified, exempt, or unsure. This has also enhanced our policies and training. What we found is when we're working with our reviewers, when a model comes up and says, I'm unsure, we have reviewers deliberate on it. And you know what? Sometimes we found that, hey, we've been making this decision incorrectly in the past. So maybe this is fit for declassification, and maybe the way we've done it before was not correct. We've reduced our annual declassification cycles. We've pushed this content out to the public domain. And once again, it's adaptable for other processes. So I know in the RLIS and DoD presentation, they'll get into more of the specifics about what these models can do. I just really wanted to cover kind of the highlights here about what we started with, where we are today. And to close on the declassification pilot side, this slide shows for public, you can send it out. There's a link at the bottom, and you can see the AI declassified cables that we've released into the public domain. All right, so switching gears to AI for FOIA. Like I said, my office is at the intersection of our public disclosure, information access programs, as well as our classification, declassification programs. So when we worked through the declassification pilot, we started saying, wow, there's certain capabilities here that can really help impact our Freedom of Information Act program. So a few things on the challenge side, similar to declassification. The government-wide request backlog has risen over the past decade, right? Requests are increasing in complexity. There's also often silos between tools, teams, and that delays public access to content. From a State Department perspective, and these are all-in costs, right? State Department for all-in spends $65 million annually on processing FOIA requests. It accounts for about 267 full-time FOIA staff. We have about more than 20,000 pending FOIA requests, and we receive around 15,000 new requests annually. And right now, it takes 190 days on average to process FOIA requests, where our statutory time frame is 20 business days. So we are behind the power curve. So there's a huge opportunity for AI to enhance our processes. I just included a graph about the government-wide backlog. You can see, and the government-wide number of complex requests are increasing. You can see that the public's asking are inputting more requests and asking for more content, and they're becoming more complex. So in this space, we said, once again, we're going to follow the same framework we did for D-Class. Let's start small, and let's answer a basic question, or try to, using AI. Have we received the same or similar FOIA requests before? Because I know in the State Department context, right, when something happens in the world, not just one person is going to submit a FOIA request. We're going to get many on the same or similar topic, but also it may span not just a week. It may span a very long period of time. And it's hard for people to remember, hey, we received a case on this before, and oh, we've already processed it, or it's in the process, we've tested it out, wherever it may be. It's hard to remember that. I always joke, I could barely remember what I had for breakfast. I can't remember the 15,000 FOIA requests that we have at any given moment. So the first question we wanted to solve using AI is, have we seen the same or similar requests before? And then number two was, have we already released documents for this case or the same or similar case? And it's on our reading room. And can we just direct the requester to that to get them access to content in a faster manner? So this is broken into two phases. We looked at the feasibility, and we're throwing around ideas. I think in the FOIA space, everyone goes to, how can AI help me redact information? We looked at that, right? Or how can it help a reviewer make that decision? A little more complex, and it requires a lot more investment. So we piloted different models, and working with the teams in brainstorming sessions, we really came up to, hey, let's do a matching tool just to identify the same or similar request, and if we've already released content on our reading room related to that. So in May 2023, we did all those interviews, and then by August, we said, all right, you know what, we're ready to go with a matching tool. By November of 2023, we had an early proof of concept, which I'll share a screenshot of it in a moment. And in February this year, it was in production. Now, one thing I want to stress here is that data preparation was huge in this space. Unlike cables, which are very, very similar over the course of years, right? They're very structured. We have a lot of metadata on it. We were talking with 3 different tools here. We have our records repository, we call eRecords, which has the underlying cables, emails, files of our historically significant records, our permanent records. The infrastructure had to be on the unclassified network because that's how we receive FOIA requests, and that's also how we push it out. We had our FOIA reading room as well, and our FOIA case processing system. So it took a lot of data engineering to get those 3 systems to communicate. And then we needed advanced analytics here. So this is more in the generative AI space. No 2 FOIA requests are the same, even though they may be asking for the same content, right? The way I phrase something may be different than the way JD phrases something. So we needed AI to help parse that out. So what we developed is really basic. I mean, at its core, it's a matching tool where, and this is a screenshot of the in production model. I mean, it's not super pretty, right? But what it allows an analyst to do, no matter where they are in the FOIA process, whether they're intaking a new request, they're picking up a backlog request, or we have a different non-FOIA request, maybe a congressional inquiry, or there's something that's of the public interest where they're saying, hey, what do we have on this topic? We can input it into the request text field, and you can take an entire FOIA request, even the ones that say, pursuant to Freedom of Information Act, and then 5 paragraphs later, you really have just the request text. You could paste it in there, and this frees up analysts' time from having to really look at, all right, what are they really asking for? So in this case, I just put in travel advisories or warnings, because I got asked at one point in time, how much have we released on the State Department website, and how many FOIA cases do we have on travel advisories or warnings? There's different types of AI you can use. The analysts can use. It's term frequency or context. Context gets into, I'm sure Arliss may cover this a little bit, into like semantic search, net entity recognition, those types of named entity recognition, those types of features. But just bear with me. So I put in travel advisories and warnings. I just wanted to see, and the date field I didn't put anything, because I just want to see what State Department had in terms of FOIA cases on travel advisory and warnings. And we get a lot of data back, right? First, we get to see how many cases do we have logged in our current FOIA processing tool. We have 40 cases that are asking for travel advisories and warnings. And on our reading room, we have quite a few number of results. Now, this was a very broad input, right? Normally, right, it would require a little bit more detail. FOIA requests generally, right, are more detailed than this. But I just wanted to use this as a use case. What this did also, and this is the same technology that we use in the declassification space, that's on our secret network, so I couldn't really share screenshots of it. But with that said, there's features here that are extremely valuable to the researcher or the analyst that's processing FOIA requests or working on declassification. One being named entity recognition. People, places, things. So real quickly, rather than doing a Boolean search and having to read through every type of FOIA request, I'm able to see at the bottom left, all right, all the FOIA requests that reference travel advisory or warnings that we have are related to these entities: the Soviet Union, Benghazi, Korea, Estonia, obviously the United States. And the analyst has the ability to just click one of those, and it will filter the results for them. So it allows someone to drill down and see connections between cases and data that they may not have been able to see before. And the same technology is used in our declassification space. So we could start looking at the corpus of cables and start really honing in on, hey, you know what? Like, I didn't realize there were these connections between, you know, these regions, and they were talking about the same subject matter. So this is, from a research perspective, is extremely valuable capabilities. There's also a lot of charts that show kind of the similarity scores. So an analyst can say, okay, you know what? I got a FOIA request on, we'll say Benghazi. Everything with 80, 90% similarity. You know what? We can start looking at grouping them. And what we found when we started doing this research is that we have reprocessed the same or similar FOIA requests over the past 7 years. There's instances where we processed it 1,600 different times. So talk about resource considerations there. We're literally reprocessing the same document 1,600 different times. And within that, we found that there were some documents that we reprocessed 15 or greater times over. So there's 1,600 different instances, and each one of those instances, we may have processed the same documents 10, 15, 20 times. That's not a good use of resources. So this is a way to real simply ask, do we have the same or similar FOIA requests? Okay, why don't we group it, and why don't we process it one time, thereby saving resources and gaining efficiencies? And then number two, if there's information that's already on our reading room that will resolve or help resolve that inquiry so we can get something out to the public versus having to wait quite a long time, we can do that. So a few lessons learned, I think, are real important when we talk about artificial intelligence in this space in particular, in the information access and information management space, is we focused on one fundamental challenge, right? For DClass, it was, can we automate the human review of cables? And in the FOIA space, once again, have we seen the same or similar request? And is there information already posted on the public reading room? So we defined clear objectives. Right, we wanted those questions answered. We set our technical and business metrics. We didn't want this to scale indefinitely, right? We wanted very short timelines to get to a decision because there's no line item, right, in our current budget for, hey, you have exploratory funding for AI in this space. So we were using existing base budget to work on these challenges, knowing that, hey, we could probably get to a net neutral state or have a cost-saving state. And we also wanted to fail fast and learn. If we were going to fail, we didn't want to put so much time and effort into this that we had nothing to show for it. I don't think that's a good use of taxpayer dollars. So if we were going to fail, we wanted to fail fast and learn why we did fail and then try again. The other side is we assembled the right champions. So I had support from my senior leadership. We had champions inside and outside our organization. We partnered with the interagency, and this really helped open up the discussion. When we started doing this, we started asking the other agencies, what are you doing in this space? And then we found out the Department of Defense, who you'll hear from shortly, was doing this. So we said, hey, let's partner. Let's learn from each other. Rather than do this in a vacuum, right, what can we learn from each other and better the entire US government system versus specific agency? The other side is I had to be, me personally, I had to be prepared for a learning curve. I didn't know what semantic search was. I didn't know what sentence vectorization was, right? But these are things, right, that impact these tools and capabilities. And lastly, plan ahead. One thing we learned in the FOIA space is data readiness is critical. You can have all the right AI capabilities, but if the underlying data is not equipped and is not ready to be used and consumed by that AI capability or suite of AI capabilities, it doesn't matter. So, we had to get our house in order with our underlying data, especially our training data. One thing that we're kind of feeling now is the long-term impacts, scalability, and maintenance. So in the declassification space in particular, right, we learned, oh yeah, we're able to use AI to declass our cables. Okay, now we want to use it on the next year. And when we did it, we said, oh, the accuracy is dropping down a little bit, the precision's dropping down. So we need to do further development, further training. So there is a tail to these AI projects that goes on as long as those projects go on. They're going to require training. I mean, if you think about it, right, in the State Department context, geopolitical events change over time. And I personally believe as we hit the post 9/11 reality, right, that model is going to require quite a bit of retraining because the issues of pre 9/11 are different than post 9/11. So agencies need to plan for that long-term scalability and maintenance. We also have to consider as part of that, right, retraining, tuning the model. It may be good for a certain set of data. It may be good for a certain time period, but over time, those models drift. And you need to have quality control measures in place to combat that. And then lastly, I think this AI can get very complex, right? But in order to tell the public the good news and the story that we're doing, we need to be prepared to explain how we arrived at that result, right? Not just, hey, we ran a model and it gave us this, but really the how aspect and going into detail about how AI works, how it renders a decision to really alleviate some of the maybe risk that people feel with the use of these models, right? Especially from an agency perspective. In the declassification space, I say this is extremely important. When we're saying, hey, AI, a machine rendered this decision and we trust the machine, right? People want answers for, well, how did it do that, right? And how does it generate that? And some of these models are very complex, so it's difficult to do, but we have an obligation to the public to be able to distill that down into something that is understandable and defensible. So that concludes my presentation for today. I just want to, once again, thank the board for having me. Thank you, National Archives, and everyone else for joining me today. Thank you.
Thank you again, Tim, for that incredibly informative presentation. Moving from state to defense, I'm going to introduce both of the speakers from the Department of Defense and have them, I think they're in a tag team their presentation. J.D. Smith works in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as the Federal Records Officer and the Chief of the Records and Declassification Division. That division provides records management, archival, research, retrieval, and declassification services in support of the Secretary of Defense and others in the department. Prior to his promotion to chief in 2023, Mr. Smith spent over 18 years working on declassification-related matters in the department. Dr. Michael Brundage is a mechanical and industrial engineer in the Acquisition and Industrial Security Core Mission Area at Applied Research Laboratory for Intelligence and Security, otherwise known as ARLIS. He conducts human systems integration research focused on adapting state-of-the-art tools to supply chain and records management domain problems. Previously, Dr. Brundage was an industrial engineer at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, otherwise known as NIST, where he led the Knowledge Extraction and Application for Manufacturing Operations Project, among other responsibilities. Gentlemen?
Hi everyone, I'm J.D. Smith and this is Dr. Michael Brundage. We'd like to thank the board and ISOO for the opportunity and the National Archives for the opportunity to speak to you guys today about how the department is approaching technological modernization of processes. And in true DoD fashion, I was coming in front of a firing squad, so I brought a shield. This Dr. Brundage, again, that's just a joke there, but we're kind of like an Abbott and Costello. We've done this brief quite a few times, and again, thank you all Dr. Brundage will drive, and I'll kind of chime in and annoy him as I interrupt. I think we have this down, Mike. We could probably do this in our sleep.
Yeah.
So without further ado, Mike, go ahead.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. And as we were introduced, so I'm from the Applied Research Laboratory for Intelligence Security. We're a UARC for the DoD under OUSD INS, working with Ms. Paula Apodaca and Mr. Jeff Spinnager. So we're really happy to be part of this because we can be that trusted agent, third-party role as a UARC. So you heard Tim mention the digital tsunami, right? We're at a point where we can't do nothing anymore. I think that's why we're here. I think everyone's heard the hype of AI, ML. How do we make sure we do that correctly is really at the heart of this project. And it's not just a DoD issue, it really is a USG issue, which is why, as JD said, you'll hear about we've been trying to brief multiple agencies, not within DoD alone, but across the USG to get this message across and work together. And that whole of government approach is needed. Otherwise, I think this thing does die on the vine because you're going to have a lot of silos where everyone's doing either the same thing, similar things, or nothing. So you need to kind of work together. It is an interesting problem, right? Because it's not just enough to release everything. You need to also maintain that national security. So it's a balance. So when you talk about, well, whether it might be a human in the loop later, well, if you didn't have national security and you only were doing it for public transparency, you probably don't. But also the other end of the spectrum is you don't want to just keep everything classified. So it is that balance. And really, it's not just tools. You need frameworks, you need this holistic approach. And really, I think it's a very modular open systems approach, and that's really where the DoD is hopefully going, where you can have different solutions at different agencies, but everyone's talking the same language. It's not just that though, and Tim made mention to sustainment, you need to make sure these tools are working correctly. And honestly, you need the right people in these offices because JD said I'm up here as a shield, but I think you need the right experts that are in there to understand, are these models working correctly at the right time? And really, it's got to build upon these investments where maybe there's not a lot of R&D money for this, but I think that's where that force multiplier working together comes into play.
Yeah. And as we go to the next slide here, we really wanted to, so we partnered again with Arliss. They're kind of a think tank, a direct think tank for OUSD INS to explore, human technological interface problems, supply chain management, things of that nature. And of course, the declassification process renders itself almost as an analog to supply chain management in a lot of respects. And so in partnering with Arliss, we really want to understand first, what is the current state of our battlefield? What does it look like? What's working well, what's not working well, and how will a tech insertion of reviewer augmentation or reviewer enhancement help that one sector? Now, and of course, in addition to reviewer augmentation, which we're going to be briefing on today and what Tim has briefed on, we also have Arliss looking at the whole spectrum of how to transform the entire process, how to get secure, collaborative, non-node entities, sharing secured information, rendering declassification decisions, working from common platforms, and not only what that system architecture looks like, but how to flesh that out, how much it costs, what kind of cost vehicle will it take. So eventually, the output of the study that we're doing with Arliss will have a playbook of sorts that will turn into an RFP to industry, where we're leading industry and not being led by industry. So as Mike and I have seen, and as Tim has certainly addressed, there are a lot of false promises with AI and with respect to contextual decision making. Because at the end of the day, doing a declassification review, you're looking at content, the marriage of content with context, and being able to make a decision at that point. And what I mean by that is, if I'm looking through a U.S. Department of Agriculture document and it's talking about a kiloton of grain, that context is not as sensitive as a kiloton of U-235 in a DoD document. And so how do you break through that contextual decision making to a computer and train a computer or an algorithm on doing that? And one of the big breakthroughs that we discovered is you can actually do that now with the algorithms that exist with natural language processing, named entity recognition, and other models, as we'll talk about. You can configure them to train on how to make a contextual decision making that is using contextual decision making models. So we're going to walk through that journey. Mike, I'll kick it back to you.
Yeah, and I think, we're going to go quickly through some slides, and we have some GIFs in here, so we have backups, so we might skip a few. But in general, right, this general digital tsunami is not just documents, right? It's an exponential growth of documents. It's not things that are only born digital, but also being converted to digital. And I think it's not as simple as, when we went from letter writing to email, there's a lot of steps that went in there, right? So we need to make sure we get this right. And I think you heard from both offices here that you have pretty much the same or similar amount of resources that have to deal with this work, right? So it is a let's act now problem. And then lastly, we talked about you need these frameworks, right? It's not just the tools. You need to be able to define what you need in terms of requirements. So these vendors are not necessarily coming back and saying, hey, we have the one tool that can rule them all. You know exactly what you need to acquire and when to acquire it. So Tim had nice graphs. I think we have nice visuals that kind of are telling the same story, right? I think in general, I mean, you can look at just the growth of digital assets within presidential libraries as kind of an analog, right? From the Clinton to Obama era, it's more than 50 times increase. And now I think you have question marks that are on the digital tsunami because in terms of if you ask the DoD and the USG wide how much classified information in terms of terabytes, I guarantee they cannot give an answer. If you look at NARA alone, I think NARA has in 2023 837 terabytes of digital information that is sitting here at NARA now in digital. But what does that really mean, right? So if you actually took that and you took the Obama library, which was 250, it's a literal moonshot. It is from here to the moon and almost back. If you printed each thing side by side and stacked it, it would be 625,230 kilometers. Again, I came from NIST, so apologies that I'm using metric. But you get a general sense of how big this problem actually is. But I think a lot of this we've talked about, right? You need that human-centric because I think our approach was, and Tim made mention of this, and it's really nice going after because they had a lot of labeled data. They had cables that were released. It's in that structured format. It said, hey, this was released or this was not. DoD does not necessarily have kind of that same type of data set that's easy to throw into an algorithm and now train on it. So we really wanted to take this kind of augmentation type approach where how do we augment the reviewers now, give them something that makes their lives easier, while then taking that information and saving it for the future. So when we have more advanced models, they have that training data already. And that requires a lot of kind of systemic changes to kind of how they do it. But we also don't want to necessarily take those reviewers and force them to annotate. If anyone here has ever dealt with data and clean data or annotated data, it's really miserable, right? I think we're all in the archives, you probably have dealt with that. Now imagine doing that on a millions of page scale and now your day job is to actually still go and review. How do we get that information as they're reviewing so they're not doing double the effort? And then I think we wanted to take the approach, DoD is not a monolith, right? It's not just JD's office doing declassification. It's 26 different offices all doing it. There's multiple different types of reviews. Obviously, a lot of this is centered around automated declassification review, but there's MDR, there's systematic, there's all these different things. How do we make sure the technologies can apply to any one of those reviews or any component? So I don't want to bore you to death with systems engineering models. I think this is where Tim does a much better job because his figures are a lot prettier. But we wanted to go around and look at the perspective of breaking it out to what are the right technologies for the job. To do that, we needed to break down kind of that step-by-step process. And you may be saying, well, there's only 4 steps here, but a lot of these things can happen simultaneously. So not only is it just a review process, there's a lot of administration that goes into it. You have those year lists that are coming in with your ADR. You have those requests coming in with your MDR. All of these things may benefit from AI, but may benefit from simpler tools. Whereas in that review step, as Tim was mentioning, right, looking for and understanding, well, did I do this review in the past? That is a different function than JD may be looking for that U235 and kiloton in the same sentence. So how do we make sure not only is it AI ML, but the right AI ML models as well?
Yeah, and a point on this slide is, again, while you're hearing a lot of D-class and FOIA focus from Tim and from us, it's the concepts of any type of review, it fits these 4 meta processes. There's an initiation step. There's a step about administration. There's actually doing the review, and then there's a conclusion. And it's not linear. You can jump back and forth between any of these. So while the picture looks linear, this in real time, there's a lot of jumping back and forth. And so we found that, again, the principles that we're going to explore here and show how we unlock technology to kind of navigate this, it's applicable to any type of information review and release you're doing. Foreign disclosure, FOIA, security review, ADR, any type of information security review that you're doing to kind of clear anything, it follows these steps. And how do we map technology to each step to really make things efficient from a reviewer standpoint?
So in our approach, again, I mean, we wanted that traceability. We wanted to understand, well, how do we actually go about and make sure we understand what the model's giving us back? And this is very simplified version of what black box versus white box modeling. And again, sorry for going a little in the weeds, right? But we didn't want necessarily where we just took the entire declassification guide, threw it in an LLM, and then said, okay, well, what comes out of this, right? It lacks that transparency and provenance. You may not necessarily know what is coming out of it. Now, it's powerful in a lot of things, but not necessarily for this. If the model is incorrect, you'd have to replace the entire model as opposed to maybe individual models. And then there's that lack of modularity in theory, because now you're taking one model and changing that out, but again, a lot of other things may be tied to it. And that explainability kind of goes away. our approach and what we really wanted to understand was, okay, how do we take these business rules, right? JD has a declassification guide. All of his reviewers are going through and looking for a certain number of things that can't be released to the public. And if that evolves over time, they also need to know, okay, how's that traceability to previous decisions? How do I now update? By doing that and mapping those actual rules to these models, you can have that traceability. So you don't necessarily need an LLM, but maybe that is the best solution. Maybe it is something as simple as a Control F. You're just literally looking for a single word. Those are the things that are easily automatable. But what if you need more context? What if you need to understand, well, if I'm trading something with a certain country versus another, I need that context around that to determine if I release it. How do we provide that content and context to the reviewer? So instead of them searching for it, they're making a quick yes-no decision. And it goes back to that approach of what we said earlier. You have that year 0 where we can augment the reviewer now, build up that training data, so in year 5 you start doing more of that automation. And hopefully you can start condensing that cycle over time, as Tim has shown with their models and something, but always under promise, over deliver on these type of things. But in general, I think it's building towards that.
Yeah, the big breakthrough here, again, is the mapping of business rules to contextual understanding models was key, okay? In previous explorations with this, through the CIA UT Austin study and through various initiatives, the models weren't quite there to bridge the gap between, not necessarily cognition, because then we have the Terminator scenario, but they kind of lacked the understanding of mapping in neighborhoods and understanding contextually what information is. And so through this effort, again, we can map business rules to contextual understanding models that will understand the why, because the why is the most important aspect of, am I releasing something or not? Why is that the case? And we felt with this approach, it really complements the state approach. As Tim kind of explained, they have a target and they're using an algorithmic model to either exempt, with refer, or unknown, right? And where that's kind of like, are you hitting the target or not? Ours is more of like, why is the target being hit? Why is it not being hit? And how can we use technology to kind of understand that so we can, again, affect decision making? And so we feel it's really complementary with the State Department's standard repeatable approach of adding, if we can add the why to that really unlocks decision making. And it unlocks the consistency in decision making, as well as being very rapid. As Dr. Brundage mentioned, a year 0 approach out of the box, these models are going to be very off target, even if they are mapped to I think it's 122 individual exemptions in the declassification guide for OSD. But as you have annotated data over time of decision making, it will drive that accelerant that's called machine learning. So you have that annotated trained data to say, in this instance, with this specific of this topic, this decision was made, here it comes up again, and it can flag that for the reviewer real time to influence their decision making.
So what does this look like? What are these collaborations? So, I mean, some of you may have seen slides. I know we presented to a number in the past, and this is what we've kind of been taking for the last year is, how do we look and work with the different agencies, and how would that work together, right? So, I mean, it's not just, hey, look for exemptions, right? I mean, you're looking for markings. You are looking for unmarked equities of other agencies. You're referring to other agencies, and then you're looking for your own equities as well, right? So how does it kind of work together with that type of model? So this is why it's not one technology to rule them all, because I think in theory, right, when you're looking for markings and you're looking to exclude, right, you're not necessarily looking for the actual individual information. You're looking for, does it have marked SCI? Does it have marked RD, right? There's a lot of different technologies that can help search for that if that's something that gets into your system. You also then might working, and this is where we've talked with DOE and CIA, is that they're obviously looking for their own equities, and that could be used potentially to help DOD or DOS work and look for their equities as well. So working and understanding where you can find that unmarked RD, or that unmarked Intel equities by working with those agencies as well. But then we have the referral process, and I see our NGA colleagues here, so we threw you up here because we've been talking a lot. But I think this is where you can work with these different components and understand, well, what are they looking for as well? And that's where that mapping comes back to play, because if you can map DoD or OSD's DG, you could do the same thing across the board. And this will allow kind of better and improved referral, where I think that's something that JD has to understand, not only his guide, but everyone else's as well. And that's a process I think that's way more automatable, because now you're actually sharing that information with a government partner, where if it's automatically referred, there's someone on the other end that's also looking at that has a need to know or can look at that. It's not necessarily being released to the public directly, and then you still have that human on the loop on their side, so you can start automating those processes as well.
So looking further, again, referrals are the big hang-up, and they always will be as a part of the declassification process. You know, other agencies' equities are rampant and originated material. And how do you get that agency to review? You know, what's their queue look like? If I send an MDR referral to Tim today, it's going at the top, and or it's going at the bottom, and there's so many others at the top just to get there. And that's a big issue, especially with the NDC, right? It's how do we have enough folks with the right knowledge in place to render decisions and facilitate referrals? We see a potential model here where, again, I have my declassification exemptions mapped. My business rules are mapped. I could just reverse engineer that to say, instead of being an exemption for flagging, it's a referral. And so I can share that exemption model with Mr. Fisher at the NDC to have an automated referral finding of all OSD records. And if we could do that, if we can get every department and agency to send in their algorithmic packages to the NDC, that's automated referral identification right there. And then take it one step further. If it's already identifying my equity, I can also program that business rule to either release it or deny it. So you can get to a lot of automation. You can scale that out quickly, but you got to start local with your own agency first, socialize with the interagency. And I do think, hopefully the optimist in me is probably 10 to 15 years time, is the NDC will operate in that manner. It would be more algorithmic-based referrals and algorithmic-based decision makings with a human in the loop still to make sure that those decisions are correct and they're running right. But and that would truly unlock, I think, the potential of the NDC and releases to the public and in a rapid fashion.
And then obviously within your own agency, right? I mean, you have to be able to look for, like we said, there are certain things that I think would be automatic exemptions in terms of what JD is looking for that can't be released. Those could be things that are automated if it is something of such high importance. But again, there's others that do require that context. So those algorithms could be slightly different. And that's where it's important to have that modularity to allow for those differences. And if those context ones go away as executive orders and other things, then again, that traceability needs to go back and say, okay, here's everything that was impacted by exemption 2.2 that doesn't exist anymore. So now we got to go back and release that information automatically. It requires that systematic, though, approach, because otherwise they're going to have the same problems in the future when you're going back and searching for those exemptions if they're not in a format that's easy to search across. So we've been busy. I think JD said it's at Abbott and Costello. I don't know who's who, but I think we have been trying to brief a lot of different DoD leaders and other USG components. I think that we are really happy. This is our second time coming to the PIDB, so we're very thankful to come here. But we've really been trying to get this message across of this needs to be a whole of government effort, because it can't just be DoD alone or just OSD or an OUSD INS alone. It needs to be kind of a coalition of folks all together working on this problem, because it really is a force multiplier to be able to work with Tim and be able to learn from what they did and vice versa. So this is how we kind of envision it. It's a very Arliss specific, Arliss literally centric slide, but I think in general that's what we see kind of a UARC approach, is that we are not necessarily developing the end solution. We are looking to test and evaluate different vendor solutions, learn from different government partners, but we could work with different academic institutions, not only University of Maryland, to be able to bring those questions if there are things that aren't solved, but then also working and actually being that kind of side-by-side partner to say, okay, you're gonna go get this vendor, how do you test and make sure they're giving you the right thing? Because Arliss is that trusted agent. We're not competing with those vendors. We're here to help the government really get the right solution. So how did we actually go about and what did we test, right? So I think we focused on the review function because we thought that was really the best approach for AI ML. We wanted to look at it really and present it here, obviously at an unclassified level, to give you that kind of what we did with state-of-the-art capabilities. And again, we did it in a very modular way, not really specific to one model or one library. We wanted to do it in terms of, well, what was needed from the reviewer so we could switch that out if needed. And we call this really operationalization of the guides, right? We went through each individual line by line of the guide and said, well, what's the best model for the job? We show a couple here, but we have the mapping across the entire OSD guide as well.
Yeah, that's really bringing these business rules to life, okay? In a digital environment, the technology's there, and my reviewers are looking at them, I'm looking at them myself, and I'm applying them. How can we use the power, as Tim, of the GPU to really bring these rules to life at a scale that our current resources would never be able to accomplish.
So one of the things that we were able to do, and I think Tim alluded to this as well, is kind of looking at named entity recognition. So if anyone knows about this, right, I mean, this is something I think that's used not in everyday parlance, but something that's a common machine learning technique. And you may be asking, well, okay, well, if you use an out-of-the-box model, how does this work? And I think one of the things, again, with that year zero approach is to understand what could be done now and how can you exploit the fact that the model doesn't know everything. So being able to present that information to JD in a way using things like term frequency, inverse document frequency, like Tim mentioned, to present that information and say, here are the important things the model doesn't know. Let's start training on those first. So again, I'm going to skip through some of these. Those were backups in case these GIFs don't work, but this is what it looks like in practice, right? So you will be able to pull a document. Again, this is an unclassified analog using Vietnam War era Wikipedia data, but you can see pretty quickly that you can identify products, events, numbers, and the like to be able to quickly show a reviewer or show someone what's going on within the document. We wanted to give that kind of configuration so they can turn things on and off as needed, because maybe it's something that is not relevant to what JD's doing now, but we wanted to be able to show, hey, it can capture all this information. But we need to build that trust, right? Because it's an out-of-the-box model, it's not going to capture everything, as JD said. So how do we make sure we can report errors within this so we can say, hey, this is something that maybe was missed and here's why? It would require some training of the reviewers, but again, it's minimal compared to having to go through and get this information individually. It could also do it if it's incorrectly highlighted as well and update those in real time in theory. Now, I say in theory because it is a research question on when you would want to update these models. If you're updating them every 5 minutes, that is a lot of compute, so you have to kind of determine what's best for that as well. We also wanted to be able to allow the reviewer to be able to flip around to different words or entities within the document or documents, so they can now, instead of having to look at, okay, Agent Orange here, kilotons here, they can jump around to the individual instance. And JD mentioned, right, some of these words also require context. So how do we rapidly give the reviewer context? So using something called concordance models, you can actually then build off that NER and now display, here's how Agent Orange is using context across multiple documents. And if you hate this GUI, this is modular enough where this could be taken and put into another GUI where someone can maybe use it in their own way. Again, our goal was to find, well, what are the capabilities and how would they be used? This is what I was mentioning earlier, where you can also exploit the fact that the model doesn't understand everything. So the model does not know what TCDD is. This is the chemical compound for Agent Orange. As you could imagine, maybe in a classified world, that's probably a piece of information that's relevant. That could be displayed to JD in real time and say, hey, we're not sure what this is, but this happens a lot in this document. Is this relevant or not? So now he can quickly make those decisions as well.
Yeah, the key piece here, going back to
I'm going to skip ahead.
the contextual search, was where a word appears or a phrase appears and what happens before that word or phrase and what happens after. Because again, that is context. So if you're talking about certain contexts and certain material, it's easy to map that to a business rule to say, under this context, with this content, you're killing it. No, you're not releasing it, or you are releasing it. So that is kind of how really we were able to bridge the gap of content and context to provide, again, contextual understanding. Contextual decision-making is what we're looking for, because it changes with the amount of words and phrases that appear in a record.
And one thing, because we're skipping through some slides, we do have publicly released information that we can share. So if you have questions that goes into a lot more detail around the capabilities, we're more than happy to answer them or send you our slides. So this is how it kind of all comes together. I think what we were really looking to do is, again, map those capabilities to the exemptions. So the reviewer may not see that NER tab. They may want to just be able to see, okay, what rules are actually being flagged within this document. So what we could do is we can now say, instead of looking across and see every entity, we can say, well, 1.4 is really only relevant to Agent Orange. Maybe in a classified context is related to those WMDs, whatever it may be. So now it's that explainability. Behind the scenes, you're using those named entities, but what you're displaying to the reviewer is what is highlighted. It's saying this sentence contains this, and this is that explainability. So now JD is not doing the guesswork. It's saying, oh, the model's flagging that Agent Orange is here, and it's telling him what exemption is actually related to that piece of information. But then you can build on that, right? That's a fairly simple rule. So, but what if it's something like all the countries in the Vietnam War that were non-neutral? So now you can go and flag a list of different things that are not just one word. Now it's a category of words, right? And maybe if this is an ongoing situation, maybe those countries are changing in real time. So you can see here, it's flagging that US is here, and it's telling JD again, what is actually the piece of information that's relevant to you. But what if US is something that is actually occurring so frequently that you want to remove that? So you can start removing things as needed if the reviewer needs. So now that won't be flagged anymore, and it gives that kind of customization to the reviewer to make those changes in real time. Again, it's a configuration management type of system where it gives the model some flexibility, but it doesn't give JD all the power right then and there to change everything. And then the last one we won't show, and then I'll move on to the next just for time, is this is what JD was mentioning earlier, where if it's a kiloton of grain versus a kiloton of nuclear. So we can look at that context and be able to look for specific weapons or weapon systems or pieces of information plus something else. So if we're looking for, in this context, an unclassified, Agent Orange plus some kind of capability or some kind of unit of measure. So with chemicals, obviously that's parts per million, parts per billion. That could be a piece of information that JD's shown and says, hey, it's not only Agent Orange, but it's also this piece of information. So now you're not looking at that kiloton of grain, you're only looking at the relevant information.
Okay, so here's how, wrapping up kind of, here's how we complement the Department of State model. As Tim mentioned, you got your cable, it's standard, it's a really structured record, it's got standard tagging, standard metadata. The Department of State model goes in, and again, it's either gonna exempt, declassify, or if it's unsure, here's where we feel we provide some value to the Department of State approaches. Why? Understanding the why is this unsure, and can we map it to a business rule with the right confidence level to make the right decision? So we'll go next slide. And so our contextual understanding models that we've developed, combined with state's approach, again, can answer the why. Why is this information sensitive? Why is it, why not? And this is how we kind of augment both of our conceptual journeys and start combining. So we'll go to the next and talk about what we're doing with that space. So we're going to run through really quickly what we're doing with each partner in the interagency that we've really discussed with DOE. We are really trying to hone in on the RD restricted data, formerly restricted data, nuclear weapon development space, and it's going very well thanks to Edie Chalk and her folks. So we'll go next. Of course, with Timothy Coots here from the Department of State, we are concluding soon an MOU between our two departments to share algorithmic packages, to play in their classified sandbox, and to really start seeing classified live bullets with this technology. So thank you to Tim and partners for that. Our colleagues at NGA are here. They have an interesting model from the classification side. It's called Conga. It's kind of consolidating guides, multiple guides, and we're seeing how we can use our technology to accelerate them looking at 60 declassification guides and coming down to one. That was a manual process and it was a success, but how quickly could that have been done with this technology? Is a good question to answer. Next, now we'll talk about phase 3 and we'll kind of close out.
Yeah, so I mean, where we are now, I think it's obviously like with this project, we're trying to make as much releasable as possible. So we have a bunch of deliverables that we've already put out there for the public. So please come if you have questions. I think our goal is not only is technology, I think it is that kind of acquisition strategy, but also the systems architectures that are necessary. How do we make sure this is repeatable? We realize that maybe our technology is not the best in every context, but how would you integrate something else if that's the case? And making sure that these things can talk together. Again, going back to that modular open systems approach, that is so necessary for this, but understanding what things will need to be standardized and the like in the future as well. I think really we're continuing low side development even though we're doing that because we want to keep up with the state of the art. I think I've joked that when we started we were at GPT-2, now we're on GPT-4 or 4 Oscar, and then you obviously have other things like RAG and the like that maybe are now being beefed up over time, so being able to use that technology as well. Summary, I think, again, this systems engineering approach, I mean, the most boring part of this slide deck was the diagrams, but really that is understanding the battlefield, right? Being able to understand what are the step-by-steps, what's the right technology for the job. That is the key to any of these processes, because I think if you just jump in and you pick a technology before you actually have what step that's gonna help, you're gonna have only incremental or no improvements. You need to understand what's best for the job. Again, I think this is something that's not just for D-Class. It's not only FOIA for disclosure, but you could start moving this back. I think you can start training things that instead of just looking for exemptions, but also looking for what needs to be classified. Those type of things can move forward as well. So with that, I think obviously we got to give a little bit of plug for DOD here. I think our hopes, and maybe we should put state up there as well, but I think is to help the government move up that mountain, right? I think it's important because I think it's not just DoD alone, it has to be everyone working together to pull up, because otherwise I think it is going to be drowning in that tsunami.
Yeah, and with that respect, this summer we're having ARLIS convene a interagency kind of not only show and tell, but also what can the interagency concretely do to kind of push standardization, cross collaborate, and truly get to that federated state that we're looking for. Because if we all work in our individual silos, it would be great for our departments and agencies respectively, but how does that really impact the federal government entirely? And I'm glad you had us both, the Department of State and the Department of Defense, come up here, because we're already making inroads to that, but we're looking for more concrete steps. So this summer, again, we're going to be convening kind of like a summer symposium. We have almost every representative of the interagency there, and it's not only going to be a show and tell akin to this, but it's going to be what can we all do concretely to push this ball forward to get federated? What standards do we need? You know, what technology is needed? What platforms do we already have? Can we already leverage what ODNI's done?
Can we go to that?
Harvey, all right.
Or some of us?
Yeah, so we can take that as an action down to open up to the pitted.
Members or staff? Sounds like a great project. I think start with you guys. We'll talk with them.
But yes, we can take down for action and communicate back. Sharmila will definitely work on that. But and again, I don't want it to be a show and tell for show and tell's sake. I want to be what can we actually do, because there's a lot of talk about, okay, how are we going to federate, but not a lot of action. So how can the interagency really drive efforts to talk to the OMB, the federal CIO for the entire government, to work on, okay, what platforms are we going to use? Can we already leverage what great work ODNI has already done to build secure multi-platform collaboration in that space? So there's a lot that's, I think, we can leverage. It's just how do we make everyone connect and play their part to get to that federated, secure, classified environment, which also includes NARA at the end of the day. Because if we all work in our silos and if we're federated without connection to NARA, how do you export the records to NARA? You know, you got to think with the end in mind, and for us, that truly is driving a lot of what we're doing. Is this stuff has to, by law, by the Federal Records Act, end up at NARA at the end of the day, and how can we all securely collaborate and carve out that to make it actually happen? And so that's what this summer, the summer symposium will be really focused on. I think we just hit time, and we're probably over, but that's the end, and I guess next is the firing squad, I think.
Thank you.
So.
So, yeah, are these working? Is it, yeah, sounds like it. Okay. So, I think maybe we'll start with some questions. I don't know if you guys want to just stand up here or run back and forth, up to you. I'm going to start with one that you've kind of already answered, but it's really important, so I think it's worth emphasizing, and that is you've all talked about how important to really getting up that mountain and solving these problems in a sort of broader way, that you need to have coordination. I think it's really admirable what you are doing, putting together this summer, this interagency group. And I guess as I said, I think you've answered this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Are you seeing from the NSC or OMB or DNI attention to trying to improve, to help with this kind of coordination? Assuming the answer is no, but hoping it's yes. I guess the follow-up would be, what do you need there, and sort of what are the challenges to a real whole of government approach?
So I have an answer to that. Again, and I don't want to be here and just compliment the board and pump your tires for pumping your tires' sake, but the board has really helped Congress get involved. So I know you asked about the interagency, but we've had a lot of interest from Congress, and actually the purse has been opened up to do this. So thanks to the HISI and the CISI, they have a lot of supreme interest in what DoD is doing, and it's been, quite frankly, facilitating the work in ARLIS with respect to this, as well as going to be helping Department of State as well with this. And as we are reaching out and touching the different interagency partners, we are getting varying levels of interest, and it's more about, okay, how, and everyone's doing something. So we found, again, CIA is doing something, DOE is doing something, Department of State's doing something, we're doing something. It's and they're all kind of very similar, but they're different in some ways, is how can we combine them, the best of the best, to get to that federal template? That's what we're kind of driving to. So yes, interest has kind of been, depending on who the interlocutor is has been kind of middling to super high interest, but Congress has actually been a great champion in that respect. So Tim, I'll please answer.
Yeah, I'll just kind of piggyback off of that. I think it's, to drive to this type of collaboration, it requires, I'll use a DoD term, multi-pronged approach for this, both at the grassroots level. I think, what got DoD and state involved was just grassroots. I mean, we were just talking and saying, hey, we're looking at exploring AI. What are you doing in this space? And they're like, hey, we're looking at doing it. And through other interagency fora, we started just kind of spreading the word, and you got grassroots building to something bigger. But in the same vein, right, to enact great change, it requires to happen at both levels, both the operational level, but also the strategic elements of the U.S. government, whether it's the legislative branch or the executive branch. And you're starting to see that come to fruition. I think this idea that we need to leverage technology to enhance operations, whether it's declassification, FOIA, or anything else, I think is growing, because I think a lot of folks see the power that AI can bring. There's also a lot of risks, right? And you've seen a lot from, especially you mentioned the NSC, the White House, a lot on executive orders on leveraging responsible use of AI. So the need to leverage technology to enhance efficiencies, to build better decision-making is going to grow, I think, increasingly, or else we're going to fall behind. We're going to fall behind our adversaries, right? So there's strategic importance there, and I think the Hill, as well as the executive branch, sees that, right? And then within this space, right, we just need to keep foot stomping. Hey, we're players too, right? It's not just in the pure strategic, realm. It's also in, the public interest side of the house, the disclosure side. So I think it really requires kind of, once again, a whole of government, not just executive branch approach, but at all levels.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. So let me just maybe make the question a little bit more specific. The Sensible Classification Act, which had great bipartisan support from Senator Cornyn and Senator Warner, was signed into law in December of last year. It required, within a year of being signed into law by the president, that OMB, specifically the CIO, Claire Martirana, she's supposed to produce a report within 1 year of it coming into law. And it's supposed to be, the report's supposed to basically be the strategy to pull together all of the different AI efforts, all of the classification guide reform efforts across the government. And it's supposed to be done in coordination with DOD, DNI, CIA, I could go on and on. So have you been participating in this study, which is basically supposed to be due in less than 6 months?
So we have not been directly requested to participate in the study.
Neither have we, and we're on the list of people too.
But I remember being an advocate for writing language like that into the bill. So we did get to provide input, and that is we definitely wanted to drive the federal CIO and OMB is going to us is strategically placed to be that standard setter, funding line setter, because they are, in OMB, as well as driving to that federalization and federation of what we're looking to do. We are engaging OMB at more of a grassroots level. As Tim mentioned, we are working with Susan Murphy, who is a part of the OMB Federal CIO Office, on just briefing her on what we're doing and how we can get more engagement and application for that standardization that the Act requires and that report.
Sorry, one last just thing I'll add for everybody that's listening, if you're interested. Just last week, 10 senators on CISI actually sent a letter to the federal CIO asking, a bipartisan group, asking for a status update on the study, which is due in less than 6 months. Thanks.
I actually want to follow up in a slightly less pointed way, but on something really similar. I really like the idea of the federated model. I think it's really important, the modular open systems. Clearly, it's something that we talk about a lot. But that question of standards and how you figure out which standards have to be set and agreement, and that is where OMB comes into play ultimately. But I'm curious what your thoughts are about the timeline from the initial symposium to coming to agreement across agencies on particular standards that could be met, to ultimately OMB guidance, essentially, on everybody has to have those standards. What do you see as the length of time that would require? How close are you on an idea of what standards would look like or what needs to be standardized? You know, what's your sense of what that would look like?
Yes. So just to clarify, standards for declassification?
No, sorry. So if you were going to, you talked about the symposium developing the sort of list of questions that have to be standardized across agencies so that things can talk to each other, essentially. So the idea of, you know, everybody can build their own systems, but they have to talk to each other, that's the set of standards, I think, across that everyone has to have. So, you know, what models get used from one agency to another? How do you make sure they talk to each other? How do you figure out what parameters have to be set so that they can talk to each other?
Okay, I could jump in as a participant of the symposium. I think the first thing we're looking for before we jump to, hey, what are the standards, are what is out there, right? Just the general awareness aspect. Because what we're finding is through more of the grassroots efforts, you know, the CIA, NGA, FBI, a lot of agencies are exploring the use of AI in particular, and each one has their own network, right? Each one uses their own system or provider. They have different infrastructure. It's just really one before we can get to, I think from a State Department lens in particular, before we get to, hey, what are the standards? It's what's out there. What are people using? What networks are they using it? Which is you know, huge, especially in the classification space. What capabilities? What AI models are they using? What's already deployed? What's been gotten an ATO to operate that we may not be aware of, that we can piggyback off of? And then I think through that exploratory work, we can start saying, okay, you know what, for this specific use case, right, this agency has already developed this. Could we make this the golden kind of standard for, you know, maybe it's cable review, right? And we could say, hey, deploy it across all your agencies. Don't even refer it to us. I think that's, from a participant perspective, that's what I think the first symposium, what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the things for the at least RLS project that we're looking to do is create kind of a reference architecture around what we believe from a DoD-centric view of what we think is needed, and then kind of distribute that among the components in DoD and also other USG to see if it's even on point. I think we've had all these discussions to make sure that we're at least close and then get that understanding of what requirements are needed. As Tim said, it's not as simple as it is in maybe industry because you have so many networks. You have folks that aren't living on all those networks, so we're trying to think of what is needed from a kind of compute and infrastructure side, but also a model and data side. So that's why we're trying to not necessarily divorce the two, but realize that, hey, there are standards in industry. We could start working towards those, but we need to figure out what we're all looking to work towards.
And to kind of close on that is, again, really thinking of the end in mind, right? What is success for us and what does it look like? Again, is that is facilitation to the National Archives. And so thank goodness that the new standards for metadata transfer, digitization were recently published, and now we can use those as part of U.S. federal government standards that all records must have these type of properties. They must have this type of information in it. Okay, so we can start at the record level, but then we can build out at the network level. All right, so if I want DoD and OD&I to talk, I got to get into the C2E environment, right? And so we got to be there. And so if I'm operating in C2E in an interagency IC federated type of system, what are the requirements for C2E? You know, what is OD&I using? What is CIA using? What is DoD using? How can we bring partners in that are not a part of the C2E environment in? And that's how we can make inroads to, like, I guess, that connectivity, but also have the security architecture to make sure that I can't wander my way into, you know, CIA's, you know, stacks and their information, or Department of State's, for example. You know, using a reference architecture will be big for security, as far as, you know, making sure that we got requisite security, we got confidence that people are only supposed to have access what they're having access to, but that collaboration for declassification that's required, that equity referral, still happens in real time. Hopefully that answered your question. I know we went everywhere with that, but.
So I have 3 questions. I'm just going to throw them out. First one has to do with standards. It strikes me that do we have an agreement as to what needs to be standardized? So there's like 2 levels, agreeing on standards, but before you can agree on standards, you have to have an agreement on what needs to be standardized. So for example, during the ARLIS presentation, when you discussed the why, why should this document be exempt? That strikes me as something that there should be a whole of government standard answer to. So that's my first question. And my other two, I don't even know how to express this one, but at what rate do we need to proceed going forward, however you want to define that, in declassification decisions or whatever, to not fall further behind? Because I think it was, Tim, your chart, you showed us we're still in the flatlands. But soon we're going to go really high up in elevation. So it strikes me if we don't take this flatland opportunity right now, it's lost. Nothing else. We can't win absent some massive jump in AI capability. And my third, I'm just curious, how does AI handle image and video analysis, which will not be important now, but will be important, I don't know, X many years, because that seems quite complex. So there could be a picture of a person in a place, totally innocuous, except that that person wasn't supposed to be in that place at that time. And how would you do that? So thank you for tolerating my 3 questions.
So I think at a fundamental level, just what needs to be standardized, from my perspective, is how we classify information, how we declassify it, how agencies then put that guidance out there from an SOP perspective to then create the right business rules to then train the models against it.
And if I may, by standardizing that, would that mean that the algorithms capture that standard? The algorithms are implemented in the whole of government, and therefore there is, I don't know if this is good or bad, there is no deviation from that. In other words, this idea of standardizing or implementing the standards in the algorithms is, from my, Dr. Strangelove perspective, kind of appealing, but,
Yes, we do have something in there, and
Does
so
that make sense?
what the model the DoD is taking with respect to your question, ma'am, is more life cycle management of classified information. So we want a 360-degree view of if this is the standard to classify it at origination, the same standard come declassification time downrange is being held. And how do you reinforce that? And that's what this technology is looking to unlock. So instead of pivoting, or the current situation is you got the classifiers over here, just generating masses of information. Then you have a huge gap, right? And 25 years of time length, if we're talking ADR, until you get downrange that's predicated on if you have good records management to get that there. Then you start working. See, those silos, even if in the same office, are so far apart. And so the model that DoD is transitioning to, again, is this life cycle management where we can hit cradle to grave, and our partners here at NGA have a great model for that. That's what their CONGA, their consolidation of their classification guidance and their declassification guidance does. And it gives you that standard. This is when it originates. Okay, at these varying trigger points, this is when that information becomes less sensitive. This is when it becomes declassified. This is when we can release it to the public. That's all in that standard. And that's what our technologies, we're looking to kind of piggyback off of what they were able to do with that concept in that manner to drive that standardization. So for DoD, eventually, you could get to, this is the DoD standard, respective of component or department, of end-to-end lifecycle management that can be shared in a federated manner. So we're driving to that. So.
And from a quick technology perspective, your question around like consistency, right? It depends on the models you pick. So I mean, that's one of the things with like generative AI and LLMs is that if you input the same prompt, you're not going to get the same answer back, right? And I think Tim's approach, you will, because they've trained the data and what they're asking for coming out will be consistent. So that's where it's important to pick the right technologies if consistency is what you need. Now, that doesn't mean that Gen AI and LLMs don't have a place. It might be something that you use as either getting that information back and then presenting it to a user, but then again, there's inconsistency in how the reviewers are going to do it. So it really depends on the technology, but it is technologically possible.
In an ideal state, right, any agency that has a State Department cable, I would say, hey, deploy our technology because it's going to be consistent. It's set to the State Department standards, which has the equity rights to that information, right? So then now you have a layer of consistency across the board, whether it's for referrals or, they can render a decision. We don't need to worry about the technological challenges of them referring information to us being able to accept it, they could do it in-house. I think that would be like the golden state, and that's what DoD is trying to achieve here, is say, hey, you know what, like, can you render decisions on your architecture on behalf of, say, State Department? And that's what we're trying to explore now, is give us your stuff, let us deploy it on our network, because we're not federated, and have it render decisions on your behalf just on our machines. So then I don't have to go through this lengthy process of referring it to you.
Yeah, and eventually, can we get that framework and all those algorithms sent to the National Archives, where that can be done at the NDC? Again, that really unlocks, to me, the NDC's potential, is not having, still having the humans in the seats, but having that referral tagging done, having that decision-making done, because if they have my model that says, do not release this, that model will automatically detect and inform the NDC folks, don't release this. So in effect, it really accelerates the current pace, the current throughput, addressing that. And at the end of the day, what we want to get is more records on the open shelves to the public. It's more transparent. It's less questions. And stuff like that will lead to less Sensible Classification Act revisions. The more we get out there to the public and we show that we're successful, I think the less questions and the less legislation will try to govern an executive type process. And the less bringing our Hero Home Act stuff kind of comes up, to write DPAA and things like that. If more things are on the open shelf, again, the less we can get Congress to try to legislate things that we already can do and are doing.
And if we're wrong, right, we can tweak it, adjust the model, right, to be right. Where that's much harder, with dealing with the massive declassification apparatus you have, right? It could be, hey, State Department was wrong during its initial auto declass review. We didn't get this referral right, or we referred it to too many agencies and they don't even want to see it. So you can detect that, right? Fix those anomalies, and maybe it's like an app of the future, right? You push out that updated version, and then you can rerun it and it reprocesses it, or it works day forward.
I think to answer your last question, Mike, do you want to talk about image and video analysis with respect to AI?
Yeah, I think, again, it goes back to what I said. It depends on what you need done, right? If you're identifying as someone in here, that's been done. I think if you're identifying as someone in here plus some other item, that's also been done. It's applying it to the right business rules that would need to be done. We've focused on text because it's the most amount of data that OSD is pushing out, but I know obviously a lot of other agencies are dealing with imagery. So I think the approach is still the same, right? Map those rules, find the right technology, and make sure it's performing correctly. And then as Tim said, if that model is performing incorrectly, you need to know why, and then you need to be able to update that model and then trace back to what was wrong when it was predicting it before.
And we didn't cover the rate going forward.
Yeah.
Based on our data, say we got 5 years, right, before that tsunami hit. So not that long in the grand scheme of things. Before, right, really disclosure is impacted because we just don't have the current resources from a human-centric approach to keep up with demand.
Can I ask you a question in context to that statement? Thank you for your report. It's very helpful. I want to say, as I'm listening to you, I continue to be obsessed with sequence. Whether capture the tsunami first, then find an application to deal with it, or find an application and develop it organically and then apply it to the tsunami. But given our role as a board, can you articulate how we can be most helpful in taking the progress you've made and advancing it further?
Again, I want to thank you guys. You already have. Your advocacy on our behalf has enabled, again, congressional money to flow as well as get a spotlight. So thank you for that. What you can do forward, I guess, it would be a pretty tough ask, but if you could get the executives in our departments, our respective secretaries, to have that demand signal of this needs to be prioritized, and it really ties into the National Defense Strategy. And if you can tie it into the Department of State's management plan, and our management plans, it shows how that dovetails and reinforces what we're trying to do with protect national security, but at the same time promote transparency, which is the foundation of democracy. That demand signal with our executives, I think, is one of the best things you can do. Again, congressionally, thank you. It's been felt. It's been, it's keeping this stuff going. So thank you all. And I do think that would probably be the next step, is to get that demand signal up with the executives to have this as a priority to be driven from. As you can see, we're kind of bottom up. If we can get top down to meet in the middle, that's where I really think we can, make some hay. Tim, did you?
On that, I'll just ask, the White House came in a couple of years ago, and the National Security Council said they were going to update the standards that go into declassification, the executive order. So how has that work been going? We assume that you've been working with the NSC to do that. How's that going?
Yeah, I personally have been heavily engaged in that effort, and it's obviously I can't get into delivery process stuff with the NSC, but what I could say is whether it's whatever classification reform act, the many drafts that have come out or ones that have been signed, the underlying themes there behind reducing overclassification, fixing the declassification process, enabling greater efficiencies, creating more standardization across how long we classify material for, when it should be reviewed. All those are being considered as part of the process. And the idea of standardization, creating kind of a federated architecture, those are also coming up in those discussions.
As well as mandated investment into technology. That is another feature, I will say, into that.
So do you expect we'll see a new executive order soon?
This administration has said they would like an executive order out before the end of this current term.
And to answer the other question again, going back to the rate going forward so we don't fall further behind, I think if we can tie this together with the latest buzzword from the boardroom to the battlefield of decision advantage, because at the end of the day, this is really a decision advantage issue as well, of having, again, contextual decision making to the right leadership, but being powered through technology. And that's where this ties into, and that is, again, what we're trying to hone in on is like, this can get you decision advantage. No matter how you deploy it, what framework, what architecture, it allows us the decision advantage over our adversaries to confidently know this can be a safer release and it won't be used by the adversary to hurt the US government, to hurt the soldier, airman, seaman deployed abroad, and it's gonna be safely done, but also increase the transparency. So this is a big decision advantage driver that we're looking to capture on that as well. Mike, sorry.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think the board, because like everyone gets obsessed with AI, ML, but all of the questions you're asking are about architecture and standards, and I think that is something that Congress and the executives don't really care. Not that they don't care, that's the wrong way to put it. It's not at the top of their minds, right? And I think that is what's the foundation for the technology, and I think keep engaging them on that needs to happen, because the technology won't happen if you don't have those standards and those foundations.
Thanks, Mike. That's a good one.
I have a question. So we talked about the tsunami, and the graph ended at a certain point, but the tsunami hasn't dissipated at all, and perhaps likely accelerated. What, if any, conversations have there been about using AI during the document classification process such that certain information, at a minimum, certain information about the document is captured and can be utilized at a later point when declassification may be appropriate? And whether or not AI is actually used to generate the document itself or simply at the threshold of creation. Because it seems to me we've talked about sort of, life cycle management. The life cycle happens even before we get to the presentation. So interested if there's attention to those issues as well.
There is. And what we're looking at is working from the back, right, to the beginning, I think in a lot of these places, because within our program areas, we control the end state, but we can start gathering data on why something needs to be still maintain classification, and maybe why, right, it was maybe not classified correctly to begin with, right? And then we can start feeding it backwards. Ultimately, though, I think what you're seeing here, and I had it on my presentation where I talked about enhanced training, and I mentioned about our reviewers, but we're also finding that we're getting data on certain discrepancies. And maybe it wasn't a discrepancy on a declassification decision, maybe it was on an original classification decision. And our class guides need to be upgraded or updated. So I think just doing the data work on kind of the historical information, especially from the cable perspective, we're looking at how long, what was the duration of classification? Those kind of core decision points. What was the reason they classified it? Does that reason even make sense? Does it even, or is there an incorrect decision to begin with from the classifier's perspective? So we're just taking it, we're working from the back of the process going forward, but I think ultimately as this matures over time, you'll start seeing, well, all right, we're fixing the back end. That's great, 25 years later, but what can we do to influence the decision maker when they're originally saying, hey, I need to classify this document? From my Marine perspective, right, it's stop the bleeding, right? That's the best way to do it, right? Hey, fix it at origin, and then, you don't have to this issue won't persist for 25 years. But our best way that we're seeing to gather that data, because we have so many people that can derivatively classify or have original classification authority, is do it on the declassification angle first, learn from that, and then apply it elsewhere.
On the DoD space, what we're doing is attacking that problem actually concurrently. So using NGA as a model, NGA has come up with a great conceptual approach, again, of how to originate information, manage it throughout its life cycle, and get to declassification. And everything is in alignment and almost like a 360-degree view. And so we're taking what we've learned here, and specifically one of our thrust areas is working with Mike Rucka, who's here in the audience, and our NGA colleagues to really say, okay, you guys have a great concept and it works. How can we provide the horsepower with this technology to make kind of a semi-manual process that has an executive board? How do we really give it that life cycle of information? And that is our thrust areas of where we're working now.
Great. I want to now turn to the audience. We have microphones at both sides, and I guess whoever gets there first. Okay, over here.
Hey, thanks for the presentations, everyone. Awesome stuff. My name is Nick Gold. I spent the majority of my career in digital archives, mostly around rich media, looking at your tsunami graph. It's quaint to see terabytes listed. And I put in many archive systems, both private sector, but also for a variety of federal agencies. And just for some context, at the work group level, you're dealing with people who have petabytes of data. So yeah, that wave is going to just keep getting larger. The theme that I think you are working towards is one of data governance. That phrase is all people really talk about at digital asset management conferences these days, and it's because it becomes the harder set of problems, obviously, than the purely technical challenges. And when you're looking to federate systems, there's like that classic XKCD comic strip with you have 14 different cable standards. Okay, we're going to solve this problem. Well, now you actually just end up having 15. So these are things to be aware of. And that provides some context, I think, to my question. In addition to my background in digital media archives, last year I started an organization called Declassify UAP. And it represents, it's a registered federal lobbyist. It represents the public's interest in getting declassification done around the subject of unidentified anomalous phenomena. So the FY24 NDAA mandated that all federal agencies must hand over to NARA all classified and unclassified documents relating to the UAP topic. And the deadline is coming up. We joked a little bit about deadlines today, but that's coming up in October. Obviously the priority is going to be records 25 years and older, but that we have reasons to believe there's quite a lot of that material out there in both the classified and unclassified realms. So I'm curious, really, from board members yourselves, as well as today's speakers, and bearing in mind kind of the approaches spoken to today, has NARA been given any heads up on any materials relating to UAP that are going to be coming from any federal agency? Have you been given any heads up on what the volume or consistency of those materials might be? I know you guys put out metadata standards associated with those materials that you would expect to see. I'm curious if any responses came from federal agencies with regard to that. And given the potential volume and that we know these documents exist, we've seen the heavily redacted UAP classification guideline from the IC. Are there any approaches like the ones we've spoken about today that are potentially going to be taken advantage of to deal with what the public expects to be a very large tranche of materials coming from across the federal government relating to UAP? Thank you. And if I didn't say it, my name is Nick Gold, and again, the org is Declassify UAP.
Nick, those are great points raised and great questions. As you can see, we didn't bring up the topic or term data governance here, but that's really what this is. And in our perspective and in sharing with Tim and I just came back from NATO, where we re-rep to the Archives Committee. That's where a lot of our work is really thrusting towards, is how do you get to data governance? Well, we have business rules that govern when information is supposed to move, at what time, and where is it supposed to go. And really operationalizing those business rules, like Tim explained and we've explained, is the key to unlocking the movement of that information in an automated way. So data governance is very much a part of this. When it comes to the UAP questions, all I can say at this moment is DoD is working on it. We have tested, we're doing the search to identify what is our volume as required by the 2024 NDAA, and we will proceed with the postponement review aspect of that and provide the copies that are required through the NDAA to NARA as requested.
Okay, I'm going to quickly, this is not a cop-out answer. First of all, we're not NARA. The board is independent. I don't think NARA would appreciate if I spoke on their behalf, so that's the first thing. But just a more macro point, which is that whether it's UAPs now, or 9/11 records, or the JFK assassination records. There are a lot of topics that have a huge amount of public interest. The board is here to represent that public interest. And it's really for the health of society to have the maximum amount of transparency on these issues. With the absence of information on these topics, many, many unhelpful conspiratorial things can take hold. And the board is here to advocate for transparency on these issues. And so thank you for your question.
Okay. Yeah, over here.
Is this working? Oh, it is. Okay. Thank you very much to the experts from the department for this fascinating presentation.
Can you identify yourself? Sorry.
You can't hear me?
No, just say your name.
Oh, sorry. My name is Chad Nagel. I'm an attorney and a contributor to an online publication called JFK Facts. And I have a question for the board at large. In your letter to President Biden of January 6, 2023, you applauded the president for agreeing to, quote, limit any further certifications for the postponement of public disclosures under the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act to the absolute minimum, unquote. With his memorandum of June 30th, 2023, President Biden appeared to at least indulge, if not overindulge, your board's concerns to the absolute maximum by proclaiming it his final certification under the JFK Act when thousands of records remain redacted or withheld, as I'm sure you know. Now, the new scheme that the president has imposed to govern declassification from now on is called the Transparency Plan. It's devised by the CIA and uses non-statutory criteria for disclosure. And for this reason, both President Biden and the National Archives are being sued in federal court for violation of the JFK Act. And what concerns do you have, if any, that a federal statute passed unanimously by Congress in 1992 is being violated? And I might also, since we have at least one career CIA officer on the board, I'd be grateful for any comment you might have. Thank you.
On the broader question, I actually think Ezra's point from before is really where we have been. I think our sense is that one of the reasons we actually started looking at that issue at all is because the more records that are withheld, the more skepticism there is, the less it sort of leads to public transparency and it leads to distrust, frankly. So we actually have, behind the scenes, consistently encouraged more release for exactly that reason. I think the challenge of process is a hard one. I think we will continue to sort of push for the maximum disclosure, particularly of old records like the JFK ones. And that really was what the letter was about. It was trying to encourage more disclosure. I don't know if anyone.
Well, I think you're referencing my letter, but our letter. But look, first of all, I just want to say, I mean, this administration has really made significant progress on getting out the records, and that's great news. But I want to correct one thing you said. You said that the CIA devised the transparency plans, and that's just completely false. It was actually devised by somebody on the NSC. And I think that that's a great model for declassification efforts going forward, whereby you actually make the departments and agencies justify why something should remain classified and what are the conditions by which it should be released going forward. So I think that's actually a positive thing that this administration has done.
Okay, over here, please identify yourself first.
Sure. My name's Julia Mossbridge. I'm a cognitive neuroscience with background, neuroscientist with background in artificial intelligence. And so I have a lot of things that I want to say, but the key ones, and I think it's mostly to you all, this first part, and then I have another thing to say to you all. So to you all, the presenters. So we all know that this explainability thing is a little hand-wavy, whether it's ML or generative AI, right? I mean, when it's generative AI, you could just be hearing a story about what's going on with ML. There's like a billion dimensions, and you're telling a story about what's going on. So given that the way that humans also work is that we have all these unconscious processes that we don't understand, and we tell a story about what we think our reasons are for things. Would it be beneficial to, I mean, what's your view on human-machine interaction in this process, and would it be beneficial to train people to think of AI as another agent, another sort of human who's like flawed like they are, and whose mistakes are going to be in an area that they can maybe figure out with, you know, basically creating a bunch of AI whisperers who operate. Does this make sense? Yes, okay. So first question. Second question to you all, the board. Do you all think about how our current interactions with generative AI, for instance, the Air Force and Space Force are giving like every airman and guardian a GPT to use and ask questions to and things like this, a whole array of them, which will eventually create a bunch of FOIA requests for whatever they were doing with their GPT. Do you think about how to manage sort of the process of working out ideas and thoughts that people are using GPTs for, which used to be an internal process that you couldn't do a FOIA request for because it was like just your thinking, but now it's out in the world, so now there's beyond exponential FOIA requests in the future. Do you think about that, and what do you think about that? Those are the two questions.
So the first question, I think, I mean, it's a very valid question. So actually, when I was at NIST, we actually took natural language processing, we started calling it kind of technical language processing, which is a human in the loop, because we believe that you have to be partnered. So I agree 100%. Now, in terms of the explainability, I agree, it's a little hand-wavy, but I think it's trying to get it to the point where the reviewer understands at some level what's being returned. And I think it's not going to be perfect, right? But at the end of the day, they have to make a decision. And I'm glad you brought up your cognitive neuroscience, because we look at it as shifting that cognitive load. Instead of JD going through the entire document, having to go line by line and understand, we can present information that may be incorrect, but now he can start saying yes, no, and building that trust in the system, which eventually will get better over time. And that he knows what is being flagged as wrong instead of trying to guess. And that at least was our approach.
Well, I think it's better, more accurate to say, build an understanding of the system rather than trust in the system, because it's not like you're going to get to the point where you're ever trusting it.
Correct, and I think, yeah, that's true, because I think you're obviously building that understanding of how the system is working, and you have a say in when it's not, and that's really what we wanted to be able to do.
Okay. So it's a really an intriguing scenario, and it reminds me of once record keeping, or the importance of it, emerged during my career, my government career, and it had the unintended consequence of getting people to stop putting things in writing. You know, so there's, you know, and I won't say much more about that, but that's a way to avoid the record. So I think it's intriguing that, and interesting to anticipate what it would mean if people can FOIA your interactions and sort of the stream of questions that you engage generative AI in. I thank you for illuminating that, because I think it's really interesting.
I think the other piece is really what is a record and what are we trying to retain and what are we trying to use it for? Because I think it gets into that question too. Because there are things that happen every day that are not formal records, and there's a good reason for it, right? They're not something that necessarily contributes from a long-term historical perspective. They might be your notes jotted on a paper, you know, a piece of paper that don't mean anything to anyone, and you're not somebody particularly important in the government, and you know, so it doesn't have the same impact. So trying to think for things like that, really, what is a record? What are we trying to retain, and why? Becomes really important, because there is plenty of data out there that is probably more useful than sort of you know, Red Merriman's you know, thoughts into ChatGPT.
Okay, last question. We're almost out of time. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Over here.
Henry Sokolsky with the Nonproliferation Policy Education Center. I have a working group that's been operating for several years, and I see 3 people on your board who have participated. And one of the things that was highlighted by, actually Mr. Rutka, if he's still here, from NGA at that working group that was mentioned by the board, was mentioned by the experts, mentioned by Congress, was it's very important to consolidate the guidebooks for classification and the guidebooks for declassification, because if you have contradictory guidance, all of this won't work, ever. I was heartened to hear that one of the suggestions of the working group has been embraced, and that is to use perhaps this advanced artificial intelligence machine learning tool to try to figure out how to consolidate what is, I'm told, perhaps 2,100 guidebooks in the government. Now, I learned, and these numbers may be wrong, and Mr. Rutka, if he's still here, can correct me, that they went in the NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, from 65 to 1 guidebook in roughly 6 months of work by hand, and it cost them roughly about $5 million. Now, by that standard, if you have 2,100, this is amateurish, I realize, but if you have 2,100, it should take about 15 years, but only $150 million to get down to maybe a smaller number of guidebooks. Can you beat that? When will you get done?
That's a great question.
Yeah, well, and how much? I don't want to pay a lot for that, because you see, if we just do it in 15 years, it's only $150 million. Can you beat that price? And can you beat it quickly? Can you
I think yes, and that is why our thrust area of applying this technology is a main part of our project of what we're doing. Again, we're not just doing this from a DoD-centric perspective, interagency collaboration perspective. It is how can we consolidate the guidance.
Yeah, well, by the way, if it was just DoD, you'd get rid of most of the problem, because you've got the most guidebooks by a wide margin.
We've got a lot of sensitive things to protect, that's for sure.
Well,
but yes,
yeah.
we acknowledge that problem, and our Office of Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, that is one of their primary drivers of why we're doing what we're doing here, is
Okay.
how can we use technology to consolidate the
I
guidance.
would urge the board and you all to think about a deadline for some standard of getting those things down. Without that, I think this is going to spend a lot of money, a lot of time, and not get you where you want to go. Heads up.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I know we had a couple of other questions, but we're at time now. I want to thank our presenters so much for really, really fascinating and helpful presentations, and thank the audience for your questions. Please, we'll be working on these issues. You should go to our website, you should go to our blog, and we will, try to have more interaction, public interaction on these and a variety of issues. So thank you very much.